All right, everybody, welcome back to the #1 television program in the history of the entire universe. I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon, The Blackest Heart, and The Lonesome Crown, all three books published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. Today I'm going to be showing you all my top 10 fantasy writers of all time list. I'm going to be counting down my personal top 10 fantasy writers of all time list. There's going to be a few rules for the list, just so you all don't get confused. The first rule of the list is these have to be authors that I have read. Yes, I haven't read every fantasy author in the world, so you may not find your favorite or the guy you think is #1 on my list. You just have to get over it. Now you can comment in the comment section, hey, this guy is my favorite, or this lady is my favorite fantasy writer, and you can put that in the comments. But don't just be a doofus and be like saying, oh, what an idiot, you didn't even include Terry Pratchett or whatever, you know. I haven't read Terry Pratchett. That's why he won't be on the list. Another rule is they have to be books that I own. Not only do they have to be authors I've read, I have to still own the book so I can hold the book up in front of you to show you. So I have to have read them. I have to have owned the book. They have to still be in my collection. The third rule is we're keeping this list specifically kind of sword and sorcery based. In other, so things like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, even though that belongs in a lot of top 10s. Stephen King's Dark Tower belongs in a lot of top 10s. I'm not going to find them here because this is more sword and sorcery. And I hope I don't break the rules of that. I might. We'll see. But we're going to try to keep it to mostly sword and sorcery. So let's get into my top 10 list of the greatest fantasy writers of all time, keeping in mind the rules we've already set forth. So starting in my top 10, starting at number 21. I know. I had to do an honorable mention. So my honorable mention coming at 21 is the three, I call them my three queens of fantasy. That is Melanie Ron, Jennifer Robertson, and Kate Elliott. All three of these ladies are just epic, epic fantasy writers, and I think they belong in my top 10 list. As an honorable mention, coming in at number 21, these three ladies. Jennifer Robertson, of course, has written a bunch of fantasy series. I've got her Sword Dancer here. Kate Elliott has written a bunch of fantasy series, and I've got her Crown of Stars series right here. And then Melanie Ron has also written a bunch of fantasies, and I've got her Dragon Prince. But these three ladies belong at number 21, and they collaborated. That's why I trotted this book out. They collaborated in this magnificent book, The Golden Key. And on top of that, all three of them I have met and had them sign my book. So anyway, that comes in. Honorable mention at number 21. The queens of fantasy in my world. These three women, Melanie Ron, Jennifer Robertson, Kate Elliott. Coming in at number 20 in my top 10 list. This guy's a legend in the field. And he writes a series actually called The Legend of Drizzt. That's R.A. Salvatore, comes in at number 20 on my list of top 10 fantasy writers of all time. She just came up with one of the most iconic fantasy figures in all of fantasy, and that's the dark elf Drizzt Do'Urden. And he's got a series of some 30 some odd books about this character. And so that's why R.A. Salvatore comes in at number 20 on my list of top 10 greatest fantasy writers of all time. Coming in at number 19 on my top 10 list of greatest fantasy writers of all time is Miss Catherine Kurtz with her Derini 9 to 12 book series of magical fantasies that she started in the 70s. I've also met her. Bear with me. I'm going to pull one of her books off the shelf. Yeah, I also met, I just dumped the entire collection of Catherine Kurtz books on the floor. But I also met her, and she also did sign all of my books. So Catherine Kurtz and the Durfee saga get place number 19 in my top 10. Coming in at number 18 in my top 10 list of greatest fantasy writers of all time. And that is the duo Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, coming in at number 18 with all of their massive, massive, epic fantasy series. The Dragonlance series, the Deathgate Cycle, the Rose of the Prophet, the Dark Sword, the Guardians of the Lost. I don't even know if that's even a series that they've done. But anyway, they've done so many iconic fantasy series. And Dragonlance, I will tell you, at one point in time when I was a kid reading Dragonlance books, I thought that they were the height and end-all be-all of American literature, or just literature in the world. It was the height of literature in my book. And I love the Larry Elmore covers here. In fact, I have met Tracy Hickman and Larry Elmore, and they have signed. Again, coming, so that's number 18 is the duo of Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weis. Coming in at number 17 on my list of greatest fantasy writers of all time. And this is another series that meant the world to me as a kid. And I just thought these were the epitome of high literature when I was younger. And that is David Eddings. He wrote the Belgariad. He wrote the Sparhawk series. He wrote, just about 20 classic fantasy novels in the 1980s. And David Eddings comes in at number 17. In my top 10 greatest fantasy writers of all time list, coming in at number 16, another guy that just did such a great job in the 80s, and a guy that I read a lot of his books in the 80s and 90s and stuff, and he wrote just a ton of things. But and so this guy is also a legend in the field. And he even wrote a book called Legend, and that is David Gemmell. Comes in at number 16. I consider David Gemmell, stylistically and prose-wise and the way he tells his stories, he's like the Louis L'Amour of fantasy. I mean, Louis L'Amour just does great Western novels about the Old West. I think David Gemmell, in a similar style and a similar writing style, does great fantasy novels. So if you love Louis L'Amour Westerns, you're going to love David Gemmell fantasy books. And I always had this opinion, even when I was younger, and I voiced it a lot on the internet, and people were like, you don't know what you're talking about. Those two authors aren't even the same. And then I read an article where David Gemmell said his favorite author was Louis L'Amour, and I was like, I told you so. I told you so. Don't ever argue with me. Coming in at number 15, another one from my youth. You'll find that a lot of these greatest writer lists that I make, top 10 lists, are stuff from my youth. And we'll get into some modern fantasy here too, but the Magician novels by Raymond E. Feist. Raymond E. Feist comes in at number 12. No, this is number 15 in my top 10 greatest fantasy authors of all time. And you'll notice as I hold up these books, I'm trying to hold up the very first book in the series that they wrote, or at least their most famous series, just so in case you're interested in any of these books, go ahead. I'm holding up the first book in the series. You can go ahead and get that book, however you get books. Anyway, here's The Magician Apprentice, book number 1 in his Rift War saga of some 20 odd books. Raymond E. Feist comes in at number 12. Great epic fantasy, elves, dwarves, magic systems, magic portals, all sorts of cool things. Assassins. Coming in at number 14, this one's going to break my rule slightly about sword and sorcery. Even though there's a lot of sorcery in this book, I mean, the word sorcerer is in the title of this book. So I can conclude this, even though I don't know if it necessarily belongs in here. But coming in at number 14 in my top 10 greatest fantasy authors in the world ever is J.K. Rowling. Of course, this is Harry Potter. Sorcerer's Stone. I told you the word sorcerer is right there in it. Of course, I love these books. I love the way she writes them. They're just charming stories for young adults and adults alike. It's probably my most young adult entry in this list. But just what she meant to the fantasy genre and what she meant to me personally, just as a writer, writing these things. And I was an adult when I read these. And I thought that they were fantastic. Fantastic enough to make my top 10, or at least, Coming in at number 13 is Brandon Sanderson in the top 10 greatest fantasy authors of all time list. Brandon Sanderson, let's just face it, this guy is the present and future of fantasy. It seems like, everything this guy touches just turns to gold in the fantasy world. He's hella super popular. Probably the most popular author in the world at the moment. You could say Stephen King or even J.K. Rowling, but I bet Brandon Sanderson is top dog at the moment. And The Way of Kings, this is my favorite series he did. I could have held up book 1 of Mistborn or maybe even Elantris, but I chose the book 1 of The Way of Kings just because it's his most epic fantasy story. And it comes in, Brandon Sanderson puts himself in my top 10 at number 13 with, just all of his awesome works. He's just amazing. Oh, and I've been showing you all the people that's another one that, I live in Utah, not far from Brandon Sanderson, and I've done several writing panels with him at different Comic-Cons and different writing events. And so I met Brandon and he signed all my books. Not only that, but when I was running the libraries at the Utah State Prison, Brandon actually donated a ton of library books to us, which was great. I didn't even ask him. He just volunteered. Coming in at number 12 in my top 10 greatest fantasy writers of all time is, of course, Stephen Donaldson. He's just got, the Lord Falsbane and the Thomas Covenant Chronicles are just classics in the genre. He's just amazing. This is another guy I met and he signed my books. Yeah, I'll show you. I've got it right up here. He signed this one anyway, the Mirror of Her Dreams, which is another great series, but he signed those. So thank you to Stephen Donaldson for doing that for me. But Stephen Donaldson was just he's one of the classic legends in the field, and the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Everybody should read them. Coming in at number 12. Coming in at number 11 in my top 10 list of greatest fantasy writers of all time, and that is Robert E. Howard with his Conan novels. These are definitely legendary. They're definitely classics. They're definitely literature. And they definitely, Conan the Barbarian, the character, definitely is an iconic character in the epic sword and sorcery genre. If not, just Conan the Barbarian is just an epic character in all of pop culture. You know what I mean? I've even got a Funko Pop of Conan the Barbarian. But then again, I don't know how great that is because I've also got a Funko Pop of myself. So I don't know if Funko Pop really means a whole hell of a lot in the world of who's really that special in pop culture. But, hey, at least me and Conan the Barbarian, you know what I'm saying? Coming in at number 10, now we're to the actual top 10. Coming in at number 10 in my top 10 fantasy writers of all time is Gene Wolfe. And this one breaks this one kind of breaks the sword and sorcery rule a little bit too, because this is kind of like more sword and sorcery and science fiction mashup of both. But anyway, Gene Wolfe is just one of the greatest authors of all time, period. His books are literary perfection. And that's why we're launching the top 10, the actual top 10, in high fashion by putting Gene Wolfe on this list of greatest fantasy writers of all time. And if you've read Gene Wolfe, you know what I'm talking about. In fact, a lot of you are probably like, he should be number one. I mean, he really should. Coming in at number 9 in my top 10 greatest fantasy writers of all time is Robin Hobb, with her Realm of the Elderlings series and she's written a couple of other series. But oh my God, nobody writes more beautifully written fantasy than Robin Hobb. I mean, just her writing is gorgeous. Her writing is epic. Her stories are emotional. Her characters are dynamic and real. And when you read these books, you feel like you're right there in it. So Robin Hobb comes in at number 9, my top 10. I can't argue with that. And then this next author coming in at number 8. Whenever I read this guy's work, I just want to quit my own job as an author. I mean, I write my own fantasy books here. And every time I read this next guy, I just want to quit. Because this guy writes so well, I just know I'll never be able to compete. And that is Guy Gavriel Kay. Now this Guy Gavriel Kay guy, he writes a lot of standalone fantasies. He's got a couple of series, but most of his work is standalone fantasy, and Tigana is just one of the best. And just Guy Gavriel Kay is absolutely a spectacular writer. But before I want to go back to Robin Hobb here, because I've also met Robin Hobb and had her sign my books too. I'm trying to remember every time I hold up a book that someone signed to remember, and I think so far so good anyway. Tigana, Guy Gavriel Kay belongs on anyone's top fantasy list. Coming in at number 7 in my top 10 fantasy writers of all time list is Steven Erikson. Malazan, Book of the Fallen, Steven Erikson. Oh my God. Just kind of almost changed the genre a little bit, just with the way he writes. This is another guy that I've met. He signed my book there. So Steven Erikson's Gardens of the Moon, book number 1 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. This guy writes if you want epic fantasy, if you want your epic fantasy to just be epic, 10 books, Malazan Book of the Fallen, a couple of spin-off series that he's done in this world. It's just absolute bonkers. I don't even want to try to describe what's going on in these books, but bonkers describes it. Coming in at number 6 in my top 10 greatest fantasy writers of all time list is Michael Moorcock. He wrote like a good 30 fantasy novels, and he's still writing. But a lot of what he wrote is classic stuff like Elric of Melniboné. He wrote in the 60s and the 70s. It's just great, kind of iconic character. Not quite as iconic as Conan, but in the realm of fantasy fans and fandom, Elric of Melniboné is one of the iconic characters, kind of like the precursor character to even the dark elf Drist Do'Urden that Salvatore wrote, and a lot of the anti-heroes that are in a lot of our grimdark fantasy books kind of took their cue from Michael Moorcock and Elric. So that coming in at number 5, we're to the top 5 now. Top 5, and coming in at number 5 in the greatest fantasy writers of all time is Robert Jordan. Comes in at number 5. Of course, The Wheel of Time. It's probably one of the most, if not most, famous epic fantasy series of all time. It's just kind of this epic 10-volume, 12-volume, 13, 14, 15-volume fantasy series. He was the first one that did it with like massive, large books. And it just was so popular. It's still so popular. And it's so well written and so iconic, with characters that just still live in my brain to this day. So, Robert Jordan in his huge epic series, everybody, you can't argue with that. He belongs in the top 5. Coming in at number 4 in my greatest fantasy writers of all time list, coming in at number 4 is Terry Brooks. This guy is the guy that got me interested in reading fantasy and writing fantasy. The first ever book that I ever purchased with my own money, of my own volition, was The Sword of Shannara here. Sword of Shannara, however you pronounce it. And I just fell in love with reading, and I wanted to be a writer. And this book changed my life. And Terry Brooks has gone on in his career to write like 40 other fantastic novels in the Shannara universe, plus other places. And again, this is another guy that I've met several times. Not only did I meet Terry Brooks, and he signed this one several times, but I met Greg and Tim Hildebrandt, the guys that painted one of my favorite book covers of all time. So Terry Brooks comes in at number 4, coming in at number 3 in my greatest fantasy writers of all time list. Top 10 is George R.R. Martin. Just an eye-opening, epic fantasy was Game of Thrones. I mean, Game of Thrones turned grim, dark fantasy into like a mainstream pop culture media frenzy event, especially once the television show came out. But even before that, the books were like making their mark in the fantasy world and in the literary world, just as magnificent pieces of art. In fact, I was reading a book on, gosh, this was a long time ago, reading a book on how to be a great writer. And this guy that was teaching people how to be a great writer was, not only was he using like Tolstoy, Charles Dickens, John Irving, literary people, but he was also using bits and pieces of Game of Thrones as examples of great writing. And just the story itself was so, it just hit you over the head like a sledgehammer. Coming in at number 2 in my greatest fantasy writers of all time list is, before we move on, I keep forgetting before we move on, I have to show you that, yes, indeed, I've met George R.R. Martin too, and he did sign my book right there. So anyway, and then my good friend Tad Williams comes in at number 2. This is another of the authors that inspired my writing so much. This is book 1 in his Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, and he's followed it up with several other trilogies and books, and he's a magnificent, he's one of my favorite writers of all time. And again, I have met Tad Williams, and he has signed my things. And he is one of the, Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove, I emulate his writing. And I think the guy that I emulate the next most after Larry McMurtry would be Tad Williams. Everything that he writes is beautiful. This was the first writer that I ever read where I was just like literally impressed with just the way the sentences flowed together, the word choices the author was using. I mean, I was pretty young when I read this, and before I would just read for a great story. This is the first writer that I read that really started to get me to notice the language that he was using in his writing. And he just is number 2 greatest fantasy writer of all time in my list. And then, of course, you all saw it coming. You knew this was going to be number 1. I don't even need to say it, but that is J.R.R. Tolkien comes in at number 1. He is just the greatest fantasy writer of all time. He belongs number 1. He finishes number 1 somehow in a lot of my top 10 lists. And alas, much to my dismay, I've never met the guy, never got books signed by him. In fact, it would be weird if I did. Although it would have been possible. I mean, I think I was alive as a baby when he was still alive. But I wasn't going around getting books signed at that point in my life. Not even close. But anyway, I don't even think I need to tell you why he's the number 1. I mean, if you don't know why this guy comes in at number 1, if you don't have a clue why this wouldn't be number 1 on pretty much everybody's list, I mean, you're just out of your skull. You just ain't got a clue. You're daft. And if you think that I'm wrong in any of my, like I said, if there's authors that you think belong in your top 10, mention them mention them below. But anyway, that was my top 10.